Welcome to the World Cup mood board. Shall we do some matchups for the final? Yes, we shall, because that's all I've prepared. 99.94, play the bumper, please. All right, let us start with England's positive batting matchups based on the fact that that is the page I have open. There's a couple of things I need to explain here, but mostly it's pretty simple. I've just looked at individual matchups between the various players. I'm not a huge fan of this, but I think for a final like this gives you it gives you a better idea of why different bowlers might bowl at different times, rather than we don't bowl off spin to right-handers sort of matchups. This is the next level of matchups. I will say this, that I've taken all the matchups I've taken up from a minimum of 24 balls. It's not a lot of balls. There are very few matchups here that even get up towards the 60 or 70 ball mark. And this is career matchups as well. That's not that uncommon. I think I once had a look at the highest matchup in a season. Might have been 2017 IPL. Was Yadav versus Kuldeep Yadav versus Warner, and he bowled 24 balls to him. And that was by far the highest matchup in that season. And, the next season, he might not face him at all. All those sorts of things happen. So it's not that uncommon for this to happen. Generally, when you get a lot of matchup data, it's more, you might get a player like Babar Azam, who might have played against, I don't know, Haris Ralph a lot over PSL seasons back to back. Some of these players have done that. In fact, a lot of this data, I would say, actually comes from Big Bash and PSL. But there's some interesting stuff in here that I think is worth looking at. So this is England's positive batting matchups, and we split it up into economy and average. You can see, I'll explain the average in a moment, but if you have a look, England have actually got a few good matchups here when it comes to scoring quite quickly off Shadab Khan. So Liam Livingstone has done it. He does only average not that much more than 30, but considering that's about his career average, that's not too bad. Then you can see that again, Moeen Ali, who we know is probably one of the best players of the ball, spinning into him that we've ever had. He's sort of on that Ben Dunk, Chris Gale type of level of just being absolutely brilliant from that perspective. So those two are very good against Shadab. And you can see, then you also have Dawood Malan and Phil Salt. So I've got both of them in here. I'm not actually sure which one of them is going to play, of course. At this point, I'm assuming only one of them. Probably more likely it's going to be Salt. But again, they have a good matchup for Nawaz there. Mo's actually done pretty well against Haris Ralph as well. And if Malan does play, he scored freakishly well so far in not that many balls against Mohammad Wasim. So if you come across the averages, so I've already talked about Livingston there a little bit, but you can then see that when we get to Mo and Malan against Haris Ralph and Mohammad Wasim, they don't have an average at all. That means exactly what I think you're all assuming it means, is that they have not been dismissed. Sometimes on these I just put in the full run amount, but clearly I haven't today. But it gives you a very good idea. So if you see a strike rate of 10 and that person has never dismissed the other person, then things are going very well. But you can see with some of these records against Nawaz, so Nawaz is a finger spinner, and as a rule right across all limited overs cricket really, finger spinners generally just don't take as many wickets as wrist spinners do. And so you see those two little spikes there. That's not that uncommon, but those are very high spikes, especially when you match it with people who are scoring off them at around 8, 9, 10 and over. And then you see Shadab as a leg spinner. Again, he's still getting them out, but I think in that case, it's a positive matchup because you're scoring, well over 8 runs and over against these players. And in Mo's case against Shadab, what are we up? Over 10 runs and over. And you're still averaging over 30. So in the space of one game, that's a really good matchup for England. So that's England's positive batting matchups. And if we go to, I wasn't sure what was going to come up next, if we're being honest. These are England's positive bowling matchups. It's not that big a surprise that England has more positive batting matchups and positive bowling matchups for two reasons. One is England is a batting team, and the other is the majority of teams around the world who have been signing up English players what are they looking for, right? They're looking for the batters because that, you know, they're known as a batting team. And if you look at the records, you know, that sort of backs it up quite a lot. So you've got here that I've got the Babar Azam versus Adil Rashid matchup as a positive bowling matchup for England here. Now, if you have a look, Babar's still, his strike rate's not too bad. It's more the fact that he's averaging mid-20s against Rashid. So wouldn't be worried about this at all. In fact, this is probably higher than his strike rate against some spinners in the world. But, you know, Pakistan's going to want him to bat deep. And so that is clearly something that is worth taking a look at. This one's more interesting. Rizwan versus Curran. You know, might be a left arm thing. It might be something to do with specifically the way that Sam Curran's bowled. The one thing that I find really interesting about this is that Curran has completely changed who he is as a bowler in the last month and a half. And there will be a video tomorrow morning just about that very fact. But you'd see that Rizwan so far scoring at a run a ball. You know, part of that is because Rizwan has probably faced him a lot in the power play. But also knowing that Rizwan averages about 140 in T20 cricket, again, still losing his wicket. So he's managing to be slowed down, but still losing his wicket. That's kind of the worst of both worlds, right? And especially for Pakistan. So that's not a particularly good matchup there. But because of the way that England's been bowling him, it will be interesting to see if we see Curran earlier because of this matchup, or you know, if by the time Rizwan faces Curran, you know, maybe the fielders are even out, or it's the end of the power play when he's feeling a little bit more set. That is worth just keeping in the back of your mind for that particular matchup. All right, so Pakistan's positive bowling matchups. I feel like I'm reading out the titles a little bit there, but that's what it says on screen. So if we come across here, Haris Rauf has a couple of really, really good matchups for them. A lot of their bowlers like Nazim Shah and Shaheen Afridi just hadn't bowled as much against the England players, so I didn't have much to work on there. Haris Rauf has bowled a lot of balls in the last couple of years. What did I say recently? He bowled the second most balls in the death, but a lot of different competitions, and so he's well known. So these are two very good economy rate matchups for Pakistan here. You can see that Milan goes at less than a run a ball against him. As we said earlier, injuries will depend on whether Milan will play, but he had actually faced quite a bit of Haris Rauf in a few different places as well, which was quite interesting. And then if you have a look at Hales here, this is a slower economy rate for Hales, but not you know, massively slow by all T20 standards. But that's obviously, I've put that in because he averages 15 against him. Now, no bowler in the database that I had looked at had taken any of these batters more than 3 times. I think it might have actually been Hales that might have had Haris Rauf 3 times. So it's not like that's a dead certainty that anything's going to happen. You'd have to go through each individual delivery to have a look at that. But the combination of those two things is quite interesting because that is a lot slower than what you would expect Alex Hales to be against a right-arm seam bowler, especially someone who's going to face in the power play. And then the fact he's been dismissed a couple of times. Just worth having a look at. From Hales specifically, though, you can see that he's on here twice. And a lot of this is just because he's in the PSL. But that does mean that there are 2 matchups that Pakistan can try against him. You know, the left arm finger spin option, if they want, of Nawaz. We saw Nawaz hadn't bowled much this tournament. He bowled 6 overs, and maybe 3 overs of those are in the last. No, it's more than that, isn't it? Because it would be more against India. But it's not many overs in the tournament. And one of those was medium pace. He might have bowled 7 overs, one of which was medium pace. But we saw him bowl a little bit in the last game. He got Glenn Phillips out, of course. This would be a different kind of surface. But they have this in their bag if Alex Hales does get going of something that's worth looking at. But you can see here, it's not a great average, but he's averaging up near 25. So, you know, it's not calamitous from that perspective, but this run rate of Hales is clearly not a matchup that he enjoys, whether it's the angle, the low arm, or the accuracy, whatever it may be about Nawaz's bowling. All right, let's get on to Pakistan's positive batting matchups. Again, not as big a surprise as you would expect here that there's a lot. That's because the England bowlers are not as strong. It is interesting that there are so many good matchups within this, but we'll take a closer look at some of these. So you could see that Rizwan and Shan Masood both have pretty good records against Adil Rashid. Um, Rizwan's a very good player of spin. He pops in a lot, a lot of different places. Although we will talk about a weakness that he has against spin later on. But you could see here, he's averaging up around 50, and he's scoring at the sort of rate that you don't necessarily associate with him. Could be partly just when he faced Rashid in those games, but combination of a good strike rate and a good average is obviously that's the dream. And then you can have a look that Rizwan also, well, Livingston doesn't matter as much, but might be interesting if England want to use Rizwan a little bit more. I think they'll use Moeen Ali more in this game, and I'll speak to that a little bit more later on. But it is noticeable that Livingston comes into this game where Rizwan comes into this game where he has a positive record against Rashid. He has a positive record against Jordan. Again, we don't know if Jordan's going to play or if Mark Wood will come in, which will be slightly different. Very different. And then Rizwan has a positive record against Livingston. That's an advantage for that. Interesting with Livingston, I would love to go back. This is where I wish we had more and more data available to us. And CricViz probably would be able to check this up, but no one would care enough to actually do it. But Rizwan basically scores better when the ball spins away from him. My guess is that Livingston, when he is bowled to him, probably bowls leg spin and not off spin. If I was Livingston and I was bowling against Rizwan, I would probably try to bowl more off spin if that was the case. So that's the Rizwan good records. If you come across to Bubba, Bubba scores quite well against Curran. It's probably, I think it's just around 7.6 off the top of my head. And then you can see though that Bubba has never been dismissed by Curran. So that combination again there, that's a strong one for them. They'll probably still try him early on because Bubba's not destroying him. He's not knocking him out of the attack or anything there. So that's certainly something to have a look at there. You can see that he's got another good matchup against Jordan if Jordan plays. We've already talked about Shan Masood against Rashid Khan. Too many leg spinners called Rashid. Adil Rashid. But yeah, again, I don't think that one is that surprising. It's a leg spinner up against the left-hander from that, and Shan's obviously done quite well. And then, why does it say Masood? That must be a tie. Now I'm confused at why it says that. Shan Masood. Oh, of course, I'm thinking Shan. So, and you can see that Shan Masood actually has a couple of good things here. I talked about him recently on one of the videos that he has a good record against finger spinners, off spinners, sorry. And that's not that common. I think outside of Devon Conway, he's got one of the best records against off spinners going around. You can see that is something. He scored really good against Moeen Ali. We're talking about almost 10 runs and over there. And then he's also played quite well against Curran. I would assume some of those are from limited balls. It actually, the best way to tell it is that the more balls are usually on the left, and so it cascades down. I did try to put the balls on here as well, but it was fairly confusing, as you can imagine. It's confusing enough, misreading my own stuff. So those are the matchups. I haven't gone massively deep into all of this. You would have to, if you're an analyst for a team, what you would do is you'd be matching this up with specific video, to MV Play or Kadamba or whoever you're using for your video. And you'd be literally matching those things up and having a look at them. Captains really like this sort of information. You can see how much I've given here. If I'm working for a cricket team, I probably don't give this much information. And the reason I don't is just because there's certain things I really want the captain to know, and there are certain things I possibly don't want the captain to know. So if you look at this, it might be something like Rizwan to Livingston. I probably wouldn't tell the captain that. I would probably talk to Livingston about that and just be like, Liam, what are you bowling when you bowl to him? I haven't gone through all the balls yet, but before I look up everything, what are you bowling? And if he says leg spin, I'll be like, great, can you bowl off spin to him? and then we'll have a conversation about that and we'll go through there. So not all of this information is, completely something that the captain would want to know. The analyst will know this. You probably have a bowling coach would know some of these as well, and the head coach would be tapped in on all those sorts of things as well, just so everyone has a really good idea of that coming in. But you could see that, there's, well, that one's a bit less, but you can see that there's a fair bit of information there. And it's also, at this stage, one of the other reasons I don't want to give all the captains all of this information is because we don't know if Jordan's going to play. We don't know if Salt's going to play. We don't know if Milan's going to play, right? There's a lot of information here that it just clouds people's minds. And I remember, talking a couple of occasions, one with a captain, another one with a bowler, who, just because we had to include extra players on it, completely confused him. And just as he was running out onto the ground, he just came back to me, and I just had to make it really, really clear. That's why you try not to give too much information. Or you see some captains, of course, now who have their little pads out with them and this is one of the first things that I designed. I'm sure most analysts have done a very similar thing with their captains. Is, you just have the matchups there. You probably won't have the individual players all the time, but you might just have the different kinds of bowling, and then it'll just be red or green or orange, from that perspective. Actually, before we get to that, let's just have a break, Muku, as I'll have a drink, and then we will get to the next part of the matchups.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
All right, so now we get to the fancy one, and Muku's gone all out with this one. Look, there's heads everywhere. If anyone on this channel knows, we like a floating head. We haven't done a lot of floating heads this World Cup, actually, but I'm a big floating head fan. Makes me sound like I am a little bit of a weirdo. But this is where we are. You can see at the top, you've got the different colors, and we'll try to make it as clear as possible for you. So left arm orthodox is a light blue, left arm seam is yellow, leg spin is green, and right arm seam is red there. Now, this particular pattern that England has is fairly traditional. There's a couple of things about them versus bowlers that I will point out that is a little bit different. But do you see how the leg spinners are down on the bottom left, and then you can see that right arm pace is on the top right. That's a fairly common thing, and you can also see that that there's a left arm finger spin and is there. But with England, they used to be very bad against left arm seam as a team, but I think Roy, Bairstow were certainly two players who had an issue with it at one stage, and so they would have been down the bottom left hand side. So the first thing that's worth noting is that outside of Liam Livingstone against left arm orthodox, England players do not have a slow strike rate against any type of bowling. You could see that there's really not that much below 8. It's really hovering around that. And then even Livingstone, you're talking about scoring at 7.5 runs and over. They just don't score slowly against players or against any type of bowling. This is one of the reasons that they're harder to get to. If you looked more a few years back, especially before they really started to hone in on different ways of attacking spin, you had players like Jason Roy who clearly had problems against spin, and England spent years giving him multiple options against spin so that he couldn't be pegged down the way that he had been before. And by the end, he was reverse sweeping every ball against spin. And it was a risky way of doing it, but it meant that he couldn't be bogged down. And that's what England want. It's very much about economy for them. They want that as much as possible. So there's a couple of outliers here that are worth having a look at outside of Livingston here. This is Stokes against left arm orthodox bowling. So not quite on the Chris Gale, Ben Dunk, Moeen Ali level of how he goes against left arm orthodox, but you could see that he's scoring, almost 9.5 runs and over, but not being dismissed by it at the same time, which is absolutely incredible. And if you go up here, you will see that Moeen Ali is the king of left arm orthodox. He's taken over Chris Gale's title when it comes to that. He doesn't mind losing his wicket either. That's the way he plays. Anyone who's seen him play, he absolutely attacks it really, really hard. So from that perspective, you wouldn't expect to see a great deal of Mohammad Nawaz in this game. However, Josh Buttler is fine against left-arm orthodox, but you'll be able to see from other Josh Butlers on this list, it's certainly not one of his preferred modes of bowling to attack. I'd say that and leg spin are the two that teams like to bowl to him for those reasons, just because it slows him down a little bit. And then if you come across to Alex Hales, again, he's averaging 25 against left-arm orthodox. Plus, if you remember back to what I said before, that Alex Hales doesn't have a positive matchup against Mohammad Rizwan as well. Mohammad Nawaz. Mohammad Rizwan doesn't bowl. Mohammad Nawaz as well. As far as I'm aware, Mohammad Rizwan is not going to bowl. I suppose Baba Azam can bowl, but that's a different conversation to be had. So from that perspective, I think there is a possibility early on that they might try the left arm spinner, just because these are slightly favourable matchups and because they have a direct matchup against Alex Hales. So it'll be interesting to watch if Hales and Butler get off to any kind of start and they're batting together, if that happens. So there's the first thing to have a look at. We've got the I've not got off spin here on this because I'm not expecting Pakistan to bowl to use an off spinner. So I made that a little bit easier for us to have a look at. You will see that there are multiple people that are not particularly good against leg spin here, right? So Shadab becomes a fairly decent option. So it's really Mo, Sam Curran, and Livingston are the ones who do like to play leg spin. You've got other players like Milan in here who's fine against it. It's certainly not what Butler likes to play. It's certainly not what Hales wants to play. Then you've got Stokes, who for a left-hander has a really bad record against leg spin. And then, of course, if he plays as well. So I'm just trying to have a look. Do I not have Milan against leg spin? Or can I just... Oh, no. So Milan, even for a left-hander, not a particularly good record against leg spin. Shadab Khan's been outstanding this tournament. So it'd be, I wonder how England will go about it. Will they milk him or will they try and, punish him? And because I think at times as well, he's managed to get a couple of wickets in a row. And that has been a big, big problem for England from that perspective. Should we go to Shaheen Afridi watch? He's going up against Alex Hales. Finn Allen had a better strike rate against left-arm bowlers, but not as good an average as Alex Hales does. But this is fascinating to see if Alex Hales goes at Shaheen Afridi as hard as Finn Allen did. Remember, Finn Allen hit one ball for a boundary, almost LBW the next ball, and LBW the following ball. Shaheen Afridi is such a brilliant striker early on, and it probably makes sense for Alex Hales to give himself at least an over before he starts to attack him. But having said that, if you can take Shaheen Afridi down from the first ball, that completely changes everything. So will Hales be given that license? I would assume he probably will. I think in New Zealand's team, Finn Allen was given that license, but I think in England's theory, they've got so many other batters, they're not too worried if Alex Hales doesn't quite come off. And you'll see that from a left-arm team perspective, Josh Buttler is also there. So I think that's the majority of what is interesting, having a look at these two, at the way that the England bowlers, I've got England bowlers versus bowling types there. England batters versus bowling types. Sorry, Muku, that was my fault. Yeah, but you get a good look here at just how everyone lines up, I think, from an England batting perspective. Oops. Why is this not working now? I'll come down here and do that. Okay, so the next one, you can see, again, we've got left arm seam, right arm seam, off spin, and leg spin. So we're not expecting any left arm finger spin. So again, just trying to make it a little bit clearer for you guys. Of course, if one of these teams does something I'm not expecting, like Liam Dawson playing or something like that, or Baba Azam bowls a bunch of off spin, that won't work for us. The first thing you can note is just that we only had one player with batting significantly under a run rate of 8 runs and over against any type of bowling. You can see the majority of Pakistan batters are under here. Right? That's no surprise. We know who they are. We know what they do. And there's a couple of outliers here. You'll see Mohammad Harris is a real outlier. Part of that is because he hasn't faced enough balls, but we will specifically talk about him. I've got one more visual that I want to show you in the next section about him. As well. Muku's changed the colors on me a little bit, hasn't it? Okay, that's fine. That was I should have said that. So the off spin is something I want to talk about here. These are career numbers. If I was doing it for, are they career numbers? I think they're career numbers. They're over a long period of time. I think if you look at Rizwan and Baba over the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, they're both around run a ball even lower against off spin. So they're two right-handers who don't score particularly fast against off spin. It would make sense for England to try and get away with a couple of overs of Moeen Ali here. At the very least, even buy a wicket is probably the wrong way of looking at it, but try and get them to play in a slightly different style than they would prefer to play in, and maybe make them attack. So that you can see, it's not that we're expecting them to get dismissed, but if you can really, a bit like what England did against India, really lull them into a position where they're knocking the ball around, I think that's a huge advantage for England, because we know that England is not going to do that from that perspective anyway. I don't think there's as much interesting parts to some of this as there is perhaps with the England one. You will see that leg spin plays a little bit of a part in some of these players with slightly lower records. With Shah Masood, we did say that he has a good record against Adil Rashid, so it's quite interesting that against the leg spin altogether, he's not had as good as a record. You can also see that the middle order guys here that are going to bat, 6, 7, 8, that kind of position, that they're not particularly good against Curran, and they might have to play against him in a death. So that is something that's worth looking at. But overall, what you would expect is that, this big group, because in this group, we just have a lot of anchors, right? And so you're expecting quite a few of those to be in that area. Not quite as interesting as the England one, but there's a few things there. I think the most interesting thing, why is it not letting me do this now? I think the most interesting thing is this one. And when I first started looking at him, I did wonder I had a look at a few clips after he made the runs. Who's the team he made the runs against? Oh, whichever was the game when he came in and got hit in the head. Must have been South Africa, was it? So after that, I went back and had a look at a few clips of him, and then I did and then I had a look. And once I'd even looked at 10 balls of his highlights, there was something that really, really stood out to me instantly. And we have to go all the way up here to right arm seam. So far, he's scoring at 2 runs a ball against right arm seam. This is just what I have in my database, and so there's not a lot of balls of him, having faced anything at the moment. But he's faced a lot more right arm seam than he does anything else, as you would expect. And you could see that at the moment, the majority of his power and the majority of his runs are coming specifically from how good he is against right arm seam. You see a lot of younger players who are very dominant against right arm seam, and they do have to sort of work their way through with everything else. If you come across here, you'll see that he's scoring also at 2 runs a ball against off spin, but he's been dismissed a couple of times. Again, it's not a lot. Because he's only played 5 PSL games, and I'm not sure how much of his record. Most of my data would be his PSL, and I would have his international games. I'm not sure if I would have the rest of his domestic in my database as well. But the other interesting thing, of course, is that against left arm seam, so far he has struggled a lot more. He's not scoring at it, and he's averaging low. generally when you have a small database for these sorts of things, if you have one outlier, let's say he's faced 30 balls of left arm seam, he's scoring 9 runs and over against it, but he's averaging 12. You probably wouldn't worry about that because he can still score against it. So with the off spin, you're like, okay, he's been dismissed a couple of times, but he's also scoring at 2 runs a ball against it. So clearly he at least has some confidence against it. This is interesting because it's a combination of both things. It doesn't mean anything at the moment, but it's definitely something worth looking at going ahead. And you know, if I'm looking at this, think about how much extra how many people would they have working on this? 4 or 5 analysts. This took me like 7 minutes to work out. It'd be really interesting to see. They'll probably be looking at every single ball they have of him where he's not facing right arm seam to see if that's just what you do against him. And then you've got leg spin. Again, it's low economy and low average. It's that combination that I find really, really interesting. And just to go back to the off spin thing, if he is coming in at first drop and you have Rizwan and you have Bubba, again, it might mean that we might see a little bit more of Moeen Ali. So that's what I have from matchups perspective. Pitch stuff, if I was doing this properly, I would also go through the pitch. The reason I haven't is I have absolutely no idea what this pitch is going to do. We've had a week of good weather in Melbourne, but it's expected to rain pretty much all the way through to the final and during the reserve day of the final. And we're still in the early season. So traditionally, obviously, if it is wet and it's cold, you would back England in those sorts of conditions with a grassy wicket. But if you look at these 2 bowling attacks and the 2 batting lineups as well, that definitely should be in the advantage of Pakistan. If it's a rain-reduced game and it's less overs, I would think that should be in the advantage of England because Pakistan want to build pressure on you by taking wickets. And if you bring this down to a 14 over, 12 over, 7 over, whatever they end up having to play, in that situation, that should actually help England just because they have the ability, they have so many players who can score at 2 and 3 runs a ball. Whereas with Pakistan, yes, these guys might get a little bit more exciting, but you can see here we have basically 4 players scoring at more than 4 runs, more than 9 runs and over, and you don't need to count how many England have. It's a lot more good matchups than that. So yeah, so that's where we are with all of that, and that's how I would look at the matchups, and I would look at the specific plans for the 2 different teams so far. We'll have a break. And then I'll come back and I'll try and get to a few of your questions.
If you love the language of cricket and want more, then head over to the 99.94 app and you can hear all of our podcasts and cricket commentary. We're adding new shows all the time and covering cricket series from all over the world. Be the first to hear all of our announcements by following us on social media at 9994DM. Welcome to Cricket's Conversation.
All right, let me get to some questions. All right. Anand says, why aren't there non-playing captains in cricket? Same reason that there's not non-playing fielders and, non-playing everything else. You pick your 11 and then you pick your captain from that. What you're talking about here is substitution, which completely changed cricket forever. I'm not against it. In fact, I've done videos about how I think it could improve cricket. They're not going to do it though, and I can tell you why. For the same reason we only have 15-man squad at the World Cup and 15-women squad. I think it would be the same for both. Pretty sure it's 15 for both. And that is because it costs more money to have more people. And so what you're talking about would cost them more money. They'd have to bring another person with them all the time. And because of that, sorry everyone, for some reason StreamYard likes to drop my microphone when you see more of my face. So that's why we don't have them. It costs money and it's not how cricket has been traditionally played. IHAB says, in the age of T20, has the 50-over game lost its prestige? I mean, lost its prestige 15 years ago. T20s have been able to include a number of playing nations where ODIs may not have. Yeah, I mean, they could have done that with one-day cricket, though. Through the 90s, we had an explosion of Bangladesh and Kenya and Scotland. Who else did we have coming through at that stage? Obviously, that was Zimbabwe's first golden era run. count Sri Lanka in that, right? One day cricket could have done that. We decided to continue to play one day cricket as a gentleman's club sport, and that meant that it didn't grow at the rate that it should have. And then there was what I would suggest is probably a superior form of white ball cricket came along. In fact, I think 40 over cricket is better than 50 over cricket as well. And it's, better for casual fans. It's better for marketing. It's better for TV companies in some cases, not in all markets, but certainly in a lot of markets, it's better for TV companies. And it's worked pretty well. So, one day cricket the World Cup still has its prestige, but whether you'd have to ask what outside of the World Cup, what relevance will one day cricket really have? Domestically, no one cares about it. Bilaterally, it's dying. For the first time ever, I think the TV markets in Asia are turning against it, and they were the ones propping it up for a long time. So you look at some of the crowds in some of the other countries when they have one days, and you think, how much longer can we go? Wasn't that long ago we were playing 7-match series of one day cricket. Imagine that now. Imagine someone scheduling a 7-match one day series now. I mean, we could barely imagine it when they did it, let alone now. John Leather, the great hypercaust on Twitter, if you haven't followed him, the absolute genius of women's cricket. I don't think anyone has done a better job in the last couple of years of documenting so many undocumented things when it comes to women's cricket. Really a brilliant person. He says, will Matthew Mott's successful transition from coaching the Australian women to the England men lead to cricket's being more opening to employing coaches from the women's game? It should. Whether it does or not, I don't know. I think the Matthew Mott thing was a bit random. Not that his success didn't help him, but I think it was really the relationship with him and McCullum that probably brought about him coming into that position. But yes, I think they are very, very different. I would like in the next 5 or 10 years, especially as women's cricket becomes more professional, I would certainly like the idea of a more natural flow. Basketball is a sport where there seem to be a lot more women coaches, maybe not head coaches in the NBA, but certainly assistants. There does seem to be a more natural flow between the two there. I think if you've coached women or if you've coached men and you have to go do the other one, you probably learn a lot more about the game by switching between the two genders. And by that, I mean, you have to coach them differently and they are slightly different sports. There might be different things that you can pick up. So I think there's really good things to be learned from this, but I think it's embarrassing that so many other sports in the world have, senior women, as assistants, even as head coaches in some cases. I think it's the Nigerian men's basketball team. I think it's Nigeria has a woman who is the coach. We're seeing American sports getting more towards that side of things of having women involved. And outside of Belinda Clark and Sarah Taylor, I'm trying to think if we've seen many other women at that level. Gemma Broad was involved with analysis with England very, very early on as well. There's a couple of female analysts in cricket, but I mean, it might literally be a couple. It's not a lot. So I think in general it would make a lot more sense. And there does seem to be still a very strong idea within cricket that women don't know anything about cricket from the men. And of course, that's just nonsense and will eventually look differently. I also think if you there was another one, wasn't there? Wasn't there a woman who just became an assistant coach in one of the South African news sites as well? But I think if you're not thinking about using men who've worked with women who've worked with women to come into the men's game, I think you're probably missing out on, again, one of those situations where the ability to bring in a different kind of coach and a different kind of mentality and a different kind of thinking. And I think quite often with coaching panels, having been involved with them, there's a little bit too samey. And it's because, head coaches quite often pick assistant coaches who are their friends and have similar sort of morals to them and similar sort of backgrounds to them in some cases. And that's all fine. But what you really want is a big spread of different kinds of thinkers, I think, involved with cricket teams. And I think that's the way to be able to do things going ahead. So the women's game is a shortcut to that, really, I would have thought. But, we're very, very early on in the profession, as you would know, John, more than anyone, very early on in the professionalism of women's cricket, and that also includes the coaches. So we're a huge step before we get to that sort of thing. But I would have thought that despite the fact that the mechanics are slightly different at times, if you're if you're working with women and you're getting, your women's team is hitting the ball harder and further than everyone else, that is a skill that, men's teams should be paying attention to and going, well, have they cracked a code here? Or is it just that, they've got a bunch of strong women or whatever it may be. Those sorts of things, I think, going forward are really important. Mahad, is the outcry the Indian team receives every time that they're knocked out warranted? Is the outcry on anything in Indian cricket ever warranted? Is probably the first way of doing it. They did pretty solid every time of their tournaments. There's a certain point when you have to go back to, 2014. And across the men and the women, it's hard to ignore the amount of times that they haven't won a major piece of silverware. If you just focus on the men directly, they have dominated bilaterals a lot in a way that we've seen South Africa do and not win trophies. Although, I think that if you look at these last two World Cups, I do think India and South Africa are the most interesting teams, because they haven't made the final each, or in South Africa's case, even made the semi-finals. I don't think I could get it within me to actually do an analysis of South Africa. The Indian team, I've got some notes on, actually, because I'm quite interested in... They are clearly in the best 5 teams, and yet haven't made a final. And everyone else in that best 5 teams has made the final. Is that just dumb luck? Is there something else that we need to have a look at? I think it needs a much, much deeper look. I don't know how long it will take me. I would say that the outcry is almost never warranted, but I do think, and we could have, people said this at the last time. I do think that there needs to be, from the outside, and no, I'm actually, even as someone who's seen how the sausage is made, I would say that the BCCI hasn't done as well at times of really taking stock of, are they using their talent in the best way possible? Are they doing everything else? So they quite often have given the reins to, Rahul Dravid and Ravi Shastri and some captains as well, MS Dhoni and Virat Kohli, Rohit Sharma as well. But I wonder if they don't have the ability, I suppose, in the way that Australia and England are probably the best ones at this, of having a real bottom to top look at your cricket. And sometimes it's just for the cameras anyway, and some of that is to shut the outcry up, right? But those sorts of things, I do wonder if I don't think this is common all the way through Indian cricket, but I do get this feeling that what we're doing is working because we're winning everywhere, but we're not winning at the top level. I have heard that from people in the BCCI before, working with the Indian team and everything else. And I do wonder then if that is the case, whether what they needed was this sort of dual embarrassment to go, okay, wait, we now lost. Our team on paper makes sense. There's some problems here. We may not always be playing in completely the right style, but we've now gone out 2 World Cups in a row, disappointingly. Do we now need to just stop and have a look at everything, as I said, from the ground on up? And that'd be really interesting. You already see some of the former players are like, young IPL players are getting paid too much money. I just don't think that's why Indian cricket isn't particularly good. But I do think there's some issues there. So I'll try and get to it. There's some stuff where it really is just about randomness. But we're now in a very long stretch where India have not won a piece of silverware. While they've been, you could argue, cross formats, probably the best team since 2014. I'm saying that off the top of my head without all the numbers in front of me, but it kind of feels like they are. All right. And just last question. Asfan says, what would be a better outcome of the two, a washout or a 7-over rain-interrupted game? I think a washout is almost the worst situation, isn't it? We have to get some play in that final, I would think. yeah, I think the washout is probably the worst possible situation that you could have in a World Cup final. If it's a double day washout, especially as it's going to be in Melbourne with a venue that has a roof, especially that this has already been the most rain-affected World Cup of all time, it would be a huge embarrassment for the ICC. I mean, they can't do much about climate change and Melbourne just having a lot of weather, bad weather at one stage, but it would be an embarrassment for one of the biggest sports in the world. But any metric, you want to have it second biggest in the world, I'm on your side. You want to have it in the top 5, I'm still on your side. It's a huge embarrassment if you cannot have your final at all. And that, there's no getting around that. We understand the weather. We understand that we haven't got a game that works particularly well in the wet. But if we can't have a World Cup final because of weather, whoo! Anyway, we'll be back tomorrow. We're going to look at the way that these two teams got to the final, and then we'll be back for the final, and then we'll be back again on Monday for the final redux, perhaps. Thanks for joining us. There's a great podcast out there. I've done, if you like the South African podcast I did, the video I did, I've done a bit more of an extended version on the podcast. Wagon Wheels Up. There's a really good, for you, I was going to say 90s kids, but I suppose 2000s kids. There's a really good podcast I've just done on Double Century on Kenya. But I tell you what, since yesterday, I've been listening to all the 99.94 podcasts. If you're interested in West Indies cricket, the latest podcast that the 99.94 boys have done there is brilliant. Same with the England boys on their team. Nikesh and Sara at India did a great job on the World Cup semi-final as well for the Indian podcast. And what was the last one? Oh, the Sri Lanka one was really good as well. But the South Africa one, I would... On a normal day, I would be individually pimping these, but there's so many great ones. But the South Africa one specifically, when Lungani is so angry about what has happened. If you're a Dutch cricket fan, you may not want to listen because he's not particularly friendly about the Dutch. But that is a podcast, obviously, for South African fans. And Lungani goes all the way in. It's a really interesting listen, actually, the two of them talking about that. But yeah, just the last couple of days, the 99.94 podcast just been nailing it one after the other. So you have interest in some of those teams who've gone out. The West Indies one really goes into the weeds of why this has happened, what's happening next. And some of those shows are really, really good. Cathartic listens if your team has just been knocked out. So go listen to all them, and I'll see you again tomorrow, maybe a little bit earlier tomorrow, if all things happen the way I want them to in my life. I'll see you then.